The candle in Evelina's room had burned down to a small stub, and outside her window, the carriages were already gathering on the gravel drive. She could hear her father's voice rising through the floorboards, sharp and impatient, telling the housekeeper that everything must be ready before sunrise. Tomorrow, she was to be presented to Viscount Pembrey as his bride, and there would be no more talk, no more delay, and no more chances for her to refuse. She had refused him twice already, in quiet rooms with her mother's portrait watching from the wall, and twice her father had waved away her tears as if they were nothing more than a passing chill. Pembrey was rich. Pembrey was willing to settle her father's debts. That was all that mattered to a man who had gambled away half his estate at cards, and needed his daughter's marriage to save what remained of his name. Evelina pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window and looked down at the dark garden below. She had spent so many hours there as a child, learning the names of flowers from her mother, long before her mother had died, and left her alone in a house full of men who saw her only as a debt to be paid. She would not become another line in her father's ledger. She would not spend the rest of her life across a dinner table from a man twice her age who had already buried 2 wives. There was still time before the household woke. She had a small bag packed with a plain wool dress, a few coins she had saved from years of birthday gifts, her mother's locket, and a folded letter she had written herself, claiming to be a botanist named Elena Hart, traveling the countryside to study rare plants for a society in London that did not exist. She had practiced the lie in her head so many times that it now felt more real to her than her own name. She changed out of her silk nightdress into the plain wool one, tied her hair back the way a working woman might, and slipped a dark cloak over her shoulders. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be still as she opened her bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the great clock near the stairs. She moved past her father's study, where a thin line of candlelight still showed beneath the door, and she held her breath until she was well past it. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused by the front door, listening for any sound of a servant stirring, but the only thing she heard was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She let herself out through the side door that led to the kitchen garden, the same door the cook used every morning to gather herbs before dawn. The night air was cold and sharp, and she pulled her cloak tighter as she crossed the wet grass, careful to keep to the shadows along the hedge. Behind her, the house stood dark and silent, its windows like closed eyes, and for a moment she almost turned back, almost let herself believe that her father might change his mind if she only asked him one more time. But she knew better. She had seen the way he looked at Pembrey's letters, counting the numbers written inside them as if they were the only thing that could save him. She was not his daughter to him anymore. She was his last asset. At the edge of the property, near the old stone wall that marked the boundary of the estate, a hired cart was waiting exactly where she had arranged for it to be. She had paid the driver with coins she had hidden away over many months, telling him only that she needed to reach the coaching in 2 villages away before daylight. He did not ask questions. Men who drove carts in the dark rarely did. The ride was long and uncomfortable, the wheels catching on every stone in the road, but Evelina did not complain. She sat with her bag pressed against her chest and watched the dark fields pass by, thinking of nothing but the distance growing between herself and the house where her wedding was supposed to take place in a matter of days. By the time the sky began to lighten at the edges, she had reached the coaching inn, and from there she paid for a seat on a public coach heading further into the countryside, toward a part of the country where she knew no one and no one knew her. She chose her direction carefully, remembering a conversation she had once overheard about a viscount in the western counties who kept extensive botanical gardens, and was said to be searching for someone to help catalog his late mother's collection of rare plants. It seemed, to her exhausted and frightened mind, like the safest kind of lie to tell, since she had spent years walking through her mother's gardens and knew the names of more flowers than most professional botanists ever learned. The coach rattled on through the morning, past small villages and wide fields, and with every mile, Evelina felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just slightly. No one on the coach looked at her twice. No one asked why a young woman was traveling alone with only a small bag and a forged letter of introduction. To them, she was simply Elena Hart, a quiet young woman with ink-stained fingers and a fondness for pressed flowers, and that was exactly the kind of person she needed to become. She reached the village of Thornfield Cross by late afternoon, tired and hungry, her legs stiff from the long journey. The village was smaller than she had expected, a cluster of stone cottages and a single inn with a faded sign swinging gently in the wind. She paid for a room with what little money she had left, telling the innkeeper's wife that she was a botanist newly arrived to study the wildflowers of the region, and the woman, kind and incurious, simply nodded and showed her up the narrow stairs. Alone in the small room, Evelina finally allowed herself to sit down on the edge of the bed and let out a long, shaking breath. She had done it. She had left behind the only life she had ever known, the house where her mother had died, the father who saw her only in terms of what she could bring him, and the future that had been arranged for her without a single thought for what she wanted. But freedom, she was quickly learning, came with its own kind of fear. She had no family now, no name that anyone would recognize, and no way to earn a living except through a lie she had invented in a single desperate night. If anyone discovered the truth, she would not only lose whatever small safety she had found, she would be dragged back to her father's house in disgrace, and Pembry would make certain she never had another chance to run. She opened her bag and took out the pressed flowers she had gathered from her mother's garden years ago, the ones she had kept hidden in a book for so long that the pages had begun to smell of dust and old paper. She had brought them with her not because they were valuable, but because they were proof, in her own mind, that she was not simply inventing a false identity out of nothing. She really did know the names of flowers. She really had spent years learning which plants bloomed in which season, which ones could heal and which ones could harm, which ones her mother had loved most and why. It would have to be enough. She had no other skills that a working woman might need, no experience earning wages, no understanding of how ordinary people managed their daily lives. But she was clever, and she was determined, and she told herself, as she blew out the candle and lay down in the unfamiliar bed, that determination alone had carried people through worse situations than hers. The next morning, she asked the innkeeper's wife if there was any great house nearby that might have use for a traveling botanist, someone who could catalog plants and identify rare specimens for a proper record. The woman thought for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and then mentioned Thornfield Hall, the estate of Lord Julian Ashcombe, a young viscount who had spent the past several years restoring his late mother's gardens after years of neglect. He was said to be a serious, private man, not much given to society, but known throughout the county for his interest in rare and unusual plants. Evelina thanked her and set out that same morning, walking the long road toward the hall with her bag over her shoulder, and her heart beating fast with a mixture of fear and something close to hope. She did not know yet what kind of man waited at the end of that road, whether he would welcome a stranger or turn her away without a second glance. She only knew that she had come too far to turn back now, and that whatever waited for her at Thornfield Hall, it had to be better than the life she had left behind. The road climbed gently through fields bordered by low stone walls, and as she walked, she practiced her new name under her breath, over and over until it began to feel almost natural on her tongue. Elena Hart. Elena Hart. A botanist with no family, no fortune, and no past worth mentioning. It was a small, plain sort of identity, nothing like the life she had been born into, but for the first time in years it felt entirely her own. By the time the tall iron gates of Thornfield Hall came into view, framed by ancient oak trees and half-wild hedges that had clearly once been carefully trimmed, the sun had begun its slow climb toward midday. Evelina stopped at the edge of the gate, looking up at the great stone house beyond it, and took a deep breath. Somewhere behind those walls was a man who might change the course of her entire future, though neither of them yet knew it. She pushed open the small side gate, stepped onto the overgrown path that led toward the gardens, and began walking toward whatever waited for her next. Julian Ashcombe stood at the edge of the west garden with a pair of shears in his hand, staring at a bed of wild roses that had grown far beyond the neat borders his mother had once kept. He had been working since sunrise, trying to bring some order back to the grounds before the last of the season's blooms faded, and he had almost convinced himself that the work was helping to quiet the noise in his head. Almost. The letter from his solicitor still sat unopened on his desk inside the house. He knew, without reading it, what it would say. The estate's finances were worse than they had been the previous year, and the previous year had been worse than the one before that. His father had left behind more debts than land, and Julian had spent the last 3 years trying to hold together a house, and a name that seemed determined to fall apart no matter how hard he worked. The gardens were the one thing that still felt like his. His mother had built them herself, plant by plant, over the course of 20 years, and after her death, they had been left to grow wild under the care of a groundskeeper who barely knew one flower from another. Julian had taken over the work himself, teaching himself from old journals his mother had kept, determined that at least one part of Thornfield Hall would not be lost to neglect and ruin. He was so absorbed in cutting back the roses that he did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path until they were almost beside him. He turned, shears still in hand, and found himself looking at a young woman he had never seen before, standing at the edge of the garden with a worn leather bag over her shoulder and an expression of quiet determination on her face. "This is private land," he said, more sharply than he intended, still caught off guard by the sight of a stranger standing in the middle of his mother's garden. "I am aware," the young woman replied, not moving from where she stood. "I did knock at the front of the house, but no one answered, so I followed the path around instead. I hope you will forgive the intrusion. My name is Elena Hart. I am a botanist, and I have come rather a long way to see your gardens." Julian studied her for a moment. She did not look like the kind of woman who usually knocked on his door. Her clothes were plain but well made, her posture straight in a way that suggested more discipline than most working women bothered with, and her voice carried a careful precision that made him wonder, briefly, where she had learned to speak that way. But he pushed the thought aside. There were many explanations for a well-spoken young woman traveling alone, and none of them were his business. "A botanist," he repeated, not quite believing her. "And what exactly brings a botanist to my garden uninvited?" "I heard in the village that you have spent several years restoring your mother's collection," she said, stepping a little closer, her eyes moving past him to the roses he had been cutting, and then further to the tangled beds of foxglove and lavender beyond. "I also heard that the collection has never been properly catalogued. I would like to offer my services if you are in need of them. I can identify nearly every plant in England and quite a few that are not native to it." Julian almost laughed. In the 3 years since his mother's death, he had received offers of help from exactly no one, and now, out of nowhere, a stranger had appeared at the edge of his property claiming expertise in the one subject he cared most about. "You expect me to simply hire a woman I have never met, based on nothing but her own word," he said. "I expect nothing," she answered evenly. "I am only asking for the chance to prove myself. Give me an hour in your gardens, and if I cannot tell you the name of every plant you show me, along with its proper use and its origin, then I will leave and trouble you no further." There was something in the steadiness of her gaze that made him hesitate. He had spent enough years dealing with tenants, solicitors, and distant relatives eager to remind him of his father's failures that he had grown skilled at recognizing dishonesty. And yet, standing in front of him, this stranger did not have the look of someone trying to deceive him. She had the look of someone who badly needed this to work, though for reasons he could not begin to guess. "1 hour," he said finally, setting down his shears. "If you cannot answer my questions, you will leave, and you will not return." "Agreed," she said, and for the first time, something like relief flickered across her face before she carefully hid it again. He led her through the garden, testing her at every turn, pointing to plants both common and rare, watching closely for any hesitation or guesswork in her answers. But there was none. She named every flower correctly, described its proper season and its traditional uses, and even corrected him gently once when he misremembered the origin of a particular variety of iris his mother had imported many years before. By the time they reached the far end of the garden, where a small greenhouse stood half-collapsed and overgrown with ivy. Julian found himself more curious about the woman standing beside him than he was willing to admit. "You clearly know what you're talking about," he said, folding his arms as they stood before the ruined greenhouse. "But knowing the names of flowers does not explain why a woman would travel alone through the countryside, offering her services to strangers. Most people in your position would seek work in a city, in a proper household, not wander from estate to estate hoping someone will take pity on them." Evelina had prepared for this question during the long walk to the hall, and she answered smoothly, though her heart beat faster than she let show. "I have no family left to keep me in one place, my lord. My father was a man of modest means who took great interest in plants and taught me everything he knew before he passed. Since then, I have supported myself by offering my knowledge wherever it might be valued. It is not the life most women choose, but it is the one I have." It was not entirely a lie. Her father had, in his own way, taught her some of what she knew, though not through kindness, and certainly not through any interest in her education for its own sake. But Julian did not need to know any of that. He studied her for a long moment, and Evelina forced herself to hold his gaze without flinching, though every instinct in her told her to look away before he could see something in her expression that did not match her story. "The greenhouse needs to be rebuilt before winter," he said finally, turning to look at the broken glass and collapsed frame. "And the gardens need a proper record, something my mother always intended to make but never finished before she died. If you are willing to stay through the season, I can offer you a room in the servants' quarters, a fair wage, and access to whatever books and materials you require for the work. It will not be easy, and I will expect thorough, careful documentation, not guesswork." Evelina's chest tightened with something between disbelief and relief. She had not expected the offer to come so quickly, nor had she expected the particular way he studied her as he made it, as though he were still turning something over in his mind that he had not yet decided to share. "I accept," she said before he could reconsider, "and I promise you will not regret it." "See that I don't," he replied, though there was the faintest trace of something warmer beneath the sharpness of his words. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, will show you to your room and explain the household's rules. We begin work at first light tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward the main house without waiting for her response, leaving Evelina standing alone at the edge of the ruined greenhouse, staring after him with a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring somewhere beneath her fear. She had come to Thornfield Hall seeking nothing more than safety and a place to disappear, and yet something about the quiet, guarded man who had just walked away from her had already unsettled the careful plan she thought she understood so well. That evening, as Mrs. Doyle led her through the servants' quarters and explained the household routines in brisk, efficient tones, Evelina caught glimpses of the great house through half-open doors, its rooms grand but sparsely furnished, its walls lined with portraits of an old and once-proud family. She thought of her own father's house, of the cold formality that had filled every room since her mother's death, and wondered whether Thornfield Hall carried the same kind of quiet grief within its walls. Her small room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the very gardens she had just spent the afternoon exploring. She sat on the edge of the bed once Mrs. Doyle had gone, running her fingers over the rough wool blanket, and allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing her father's house, to feel something close to hope. She had a place to stay. She had a purpose, however invented, that gave her days shape and meaning. And she had, though she was not yet ready to examine the feeling too closely, a strange and growing curiosity about the man who had hired her without knowing a single true thing about who she really was. Outside her window, the garden stretched out in the fading evening light, wild and overgrown in places, carefully tended in others, much like the man who had inherited them. Evelina watched the shadows lengthen across the flower beds and told herself, firmly, that she would guard her secret carefully, that she would do the work well, and that she would not allow herself to feel anything more than gratitude toward Lord Julian Ashcombe. It was, she would soon discover, a promise far easier made than kept. Downstairs in his study, Julian sat at his desk with the unopened letter from his solicitor still lying untouched before him, though his thoughts were no longer on his family's debts. He kept thinking of the young woman standing at the edge of his garden, her answers too precise, her bearing too composed, her story just slightly too smooth for someone who claimed to have spent her life wandering the countryside offering her services to strangers. He did not know what she was hiding, but he was certain, in the quiet way a careful man becomes certain of such things, that she was hiding something. He told himself it did not matter. He needed help with the gardens, and she had proven her knowledge beyond any reasonable doubt. Whatever secrets she carried were her own business, so long as they did not threaten his household or his family's already fragile reputation. He picked up his pen, intending to finally answer the letter from his solicitor, but found his gaze drifting instead toward the window, where the last light of evening still touched the tops of the garden hedges. Somewhere out there, in the small room he had given her, a stranger calling herself Elena Hart was settling into a life built on a story he did not yet know was false. And neither of them could have guessed, on that first strange afternoon, how deeply their two carefully guarded lives were about to become entangled. The days at Thornfield Hall fell quickly into a steady rhythm. Evelina rose before dawn each morning, dressed in the plain clothes Mrs. Doyle had given her, and made her way out to the gardens while the grass was still wet with dew. Julian was often already there, working with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and though neither of them spoke much in those early hours, Evelina found she did not mind the silence. It gave her time to study the plants carefully. Before writing their names and descriptions into the leather-bound ledger, he had provided for the estate's new botanical record. She had never done real physical work before in her life, and the first week left her hands blistered, and her back aching in ways she had never imagined possible. But she said nothing of her discomfort, determined not to give Julian any reason to doubt the story she had told him. She learned to kneel in the dirt without complaint, to carry buckets of water for the thirsty rows of new seedlings, and to mend the tools that broke under the strain of clearing years of neglect from the overgrown beds. Julian, for his part, watched her more closely than he let on. He noticed the way her hands, though clearly unused to hard labor, grew steadier and more capable with each passing day. He noticed the careful, elegant handwriting she used in the ledger, so different from the rough, practical scrawl he might have expected from a woman who claimed to have spent years wandering from estate to estate. And he noticed, though he tried not to dwell on it, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, even when covered in dirt from the garden beds, even when exhausted from a long day's work. He told himself repeatedly that it was none of his concern. She did her work well, better than well, in fact, identifying several rare specimens in his mother's collection that even he had not recognized. The greenhouse was slowly being rebuilt with the help of 2 hired workmen from the village, and for the first time in years, the gardens at Thornfield Hall were beginning to look the way they had when his mother was still alive to tend them. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into her time at the hall, a sudden storm rolled in from the western hills while Evelina was working alone in the far corner of the garden, gathering seeds from a bed of late-blooming asters before the coming frost could ruin them. She had not noticed the darkening sky until the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, and by the time she gathered her basket and started back toward the house, the storm had already grown fierce, the wind bending the trees and driving the rain sideways across the open lawn. She was halfway across the garden when a gust of wind tore a large branch from one of the old oak trees lining the path, and it crashed down directly in front of her, close enough that she stumbled backward and fell hard onto the wet grass. For a moment, she simply lay there, stunned, rain soaking through her clothes, her basket of carefully gathered seeds scattered across the ground around her. "Elena!" She heard Julian's voice through the roar of the storm before she saw him running toward her, his coat already soaked through, his face pale with alarm. He reached her side in seconds, kneeling beside her in the mud without any regard for his own clothes, his hands moving quickly but carefully over her arms and shoulders as he checked for injury. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "The branch missed me. I only lost my balance." "You could have been killed," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that surprised her, a fear that seemed to go beyond simple concern for an employee's safety. He helped her to her feet, one arm wrapped firmly around her waist to steady her against the wind, and together they made their way back toward the house, leaving the scattered seeds and the fallen branch behind them in the storm. By the time they reached the shelter of the entrance hall, both of them were soaked through and breathing hard, and for a long moment they simply stood there, dripping onto the stone floor, neither quite willing to step away from the other. Evelina became suddenly, acutely aware of how close he was standing, of the warmth of his arms still resting against her back, of the way his dark hair clung to his forehead, damp and disheveled in a manner entirely unlike his usual careful composure. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming after me." "I could hardly have done otherwise," he replied, though his voice had lost its usual sharpness. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then, as if catching himself, he stepped back and cleared his throat. "You should change out of those wet clothes before you catch a chill. Mrs. Doyle will have the fires lit in the sitting room. Come warm yourself before you return to your quarters." She nodded, unable to trust her voice just then, and followed him through the quiet house to the sitting room, where a fire had indeed already been lit against the growing chill of the storm outside. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, wrapped in dry blankets Mrs. Doyle had quickly brought, and for the first time since Evelina had arrived at Thornfield Hall, the silence between them did not feel like the careful distance of employer and employee, but something gentler, something neither of them yet had the words to name. "You gave me quite a fright," Julian said eventually, staring into the flames rather than at her. "I have already lost a great deal in this life, Miss Hart." I did not care to add a falling tree branch to the list. "You mean the greenhouse," she said, trying to keep the moment light. "I promised the seeds I lost were not so valuable as all that." "I did not mean the greenhouse," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made her breath catch in her throat. He did not elaborate further, and she did not ask him to, though the words stayed with her long after she had returned to her small room that night, changed into dry clothes, and lay awake listening to the storm finally begin to ease outside her window. She thought of her father's cold house, of Pembry's calculating eyes, of the marriage she had fled rather than endure, and she thought, with a growing unease she could not quite ignore, that she had not expected to find anything at Thornfield Hall that might make her forget, even for a moment, the danger she was still running from. The following morning brought a different kind of storm entirely. Mrs. Doyle came to find Evelina in the garden not long after breakfast, her expression troubled, holding a folded letter that had arrived with the morning post addressed simply to the young woman employed in the gardens at Thornfield Hall. "A traveler left this at the inn in the village yesterday," Mrs. Doyle said, handing over the letter with visible reluctance. "He asked the innkeeper's wife whether a young lady matching a particular description had passed through recently. She thought it strange enough to mention it to the carrier this morning, and he thought I ought to know, given that you're the only new arrival we've had in some time." Evelina's hands trembled as she took the letter, though she forced herself to keep her expression calm. She unfolded it slowly, and though it contained no signature, no name she recognized, the careful, formal handwriting was unmistakably the sort used by someone accustomed to writing legal correspondence. It described, in vague but pointed terms, a young woman of gentle birth who had recently left her family under distressing circumstances, and it offered a substantial reward for any information leading to her safe return. There was no mention of her name. There was no mention of Thornfield Hall specifically, but the description, though careful to avoid anything too identifying, was close enough to unsettle her deeply. Someone was searching for her, and they had already come close enough to leave inquiries at the very village where she had taken shelter. "Is everything all right, miss?" Mrs. Doyle asked, watching her closely. "Yes," Evelina said, folding the letter quickly and tucking it into the pocket of her apron. "Only a message from an old acquaintance, nothing of concern." Mrs. Doyle did not look entirely convinced, but she said nothing further, only nodded and returned to her duties inside the house, leaving Evelina standing alone among the flower beds with her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She spent the rest of the day working with a distracted, anxious energy, her eyes drifting constantly toward the long drive leading up to the hall, half expecting to see a carriage appear at any moment carrying her father's men, or worse, Pembry himself. She said nothing to Julian of the letter, though she noticed him watching her more closely than usual as the day wore on, his sharp eyes clearly picking up on the change in her manner even if he could not guess its cause. That evening, as she sat alone in her small room, Evelina finally allowed herself to consider, with clear and frightened honesty, just how precarious her situation truly was. She had built a new life on a foundation of lies, and that foundation, she now understood, was far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. A single careless word, a single traveler with a sharp memory, a single letter left at the wrong inn, and everything she had built at Thornfield Hall could collapse in an instant. And yet, even as fear tightened its grip around her chest, she found her thoughts returning, again and again, to the way Julian had run through the storm to reach her, to the raw fear in his voice when he called her name, to the quiet weight of his words by the fire. She had come to Thornfield Hall seeking only safety. She had not expected to find someone who made her want, however dangerously, to stay. She knew she should leave. Every instinct born of months of careful planning told her that the safest course was to disappear again, to find some new village, some new lie, some new life far from anyone who might recognize her description. But when she thought of leaving the garden she had come to love, of leaving the ledger filled with her own careful handwriting, of leaving Julian without a single word of explanation, something in her resisted the idea with a stubbornness that frightened her nearly as much as the letter in her pocket. She decided, finally, that she would stay a little longer. She would be more careful, more watchful, and if the danger grew too close, she would leave without hesitation, whatever it cost her. But for now, for just a little while longer, she allowed herself to hope that Thornfield Hall might remain, however briefly, the safe place she so desperately needed it to be. Outside her window, the gardens lay quiet and dark beneath a sky slowly clearing after the storm, the scattered seeds from the fallen aster bed already washed into the soil, where new growth would eventually rise without anyone remembering exactly how it had begun. Evelina closed her eyes and told herself, one more time, that she was still Elena Hart, a botanist with no past worth mentioning, and that whoever was searching for the Earl's missing daughter would never think to look for her among the flower beds of a struggling viscount's forgotten gardens. She did not yet know how wrong she was. The village of Thornfield Cross held its harvest fair on the first fine Saturday of autumn, and Mrs. Doyle insisted that the entire household attend, arguing that even a viscount deep in debt owed his tenants at least one afternoon of goodwill each year. Julian agreed with visible reluctance, and Evelina found herself walking beside him down the long road into the village, dressed in her plainest gown, her hair pinned back in the simple style she had practiced until it no longer felt strange to her. The fair filled the village green with color and noise, stalls selling preserved fruit and woven baskets, children chasing each other between the legs of grazing horses, and a small group of musicians tuning their instruments near a makeshift dance floor of trampled grass. Evelina had not attended anything like it since she was a small child, sneaking away from her governess to watch similar gatherings from a safe distance, never allowed to join in herself. For a few hours, she nearly forgot to be careful. She let herself laugh at the antics of a juggler who dropped more apples than he caught, let herself enjoy the taste of warm, spiced cider bought from a stall run by a cheerful, red-faced farmer's wife, and let herself walk beside Julian through the crowd with an ease that felt, for once, entirely unforced. It was the dancing that nearly undid her. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and several couples moved onto the grass, and Mrs. Doyle, standing nearby with a knowing smile, gently pushed Evelina forward and suggested that a young lady ought not to spend the whole fair standing at the edge of the crowd. Before she could think better of it, Evelina found herself being led onto the dance floor, not by Julian, but by one of the young farmhands from a neighboring estate, a cheerful boy who clearly meant nothing by the invitation beyond simple friendliness. She moved through the steps without thinking, her body remembering the careful lessons of countless childhood dancing masters, her feet finding the pattern of the dance with a natural grace that no village girl, however talented, would have possessed. She realized her mistake only when she caught sight of Julian standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching her with an expression of open and unmistakable surprise. She finished the dance as quickly as she could without appearing rude, thanked her partner, and made her way back toward Julian with her heart pounding uncomfortably fast. "You dance remarkably well, Miss Hart," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. "Rather better, I would say, than most working women have occasion to learn." "My mother taught me," Evelina said quickly, reaching for the explanation she had prepared long ago for exactly this kind of moment. She believed every woman ought to know how to dance properly, whatever her station in life. She had rather grand notions, for a woman of modest means. It was, she knew, a thin excuse, but Julian did not press the matter further, though the careful, considering look in his eyes told her he had not entirely accepted her answer either. He offered her his arm instead, suggesting they walk toward the stalls selling ribbons and trinkets, and Evelina took it gratefully, relieved to have the moment pass without further questions, even as she silently scolded herself for the careless slip. But the danger of the day was not yet finished. Later that afternoon, as the fair began to wind down and the shadows lengthened across the green, a small gathering formed near the musicians, where someone had produced a battered old pianoforte, dragged out from the village hall for the occasion. Several young people took turns attempting simple tunes, laughing at their own mistakes, and when the instrument was finally left empty for a moment, Mrs. Doyle, without thinking of the consequences, turned to Evelina with a bright, encouraging smile. "Do you play, my dear? You seem the sort who might." Evelina hesitated, every instinct warning her to refuse, but the small crowd had already turned expectant eyes toward her, and refusing outright would have drawn more attention than simply obliging them. She sat down at the worn instrument, told herself firmly to play something simple, something a self-taught village girl might reasonably know, and began a plain, unremarkable melody her fingers remembered from years of formal lessons she had never wanted, in a house that had cared more for her accomplishments than her happiness. She kept the piece deliberately simple, deliberately imperfect, striking a few small mistakes on purpose to disguise the years of careful training beneath her fingers. But even simplified, the melody carried an unmistakable polish, a precision in timing and touch that no untrained hand could easily fake. When she finished, the small crowd applauded warmly, unaware of anything unusual. But when she glanced up, she found Julian watching her again, his expression no longer simply curious, but genuinely troubled. He said nothing more about it for the rest of the day, but that evening, back at Thornfield Hall, Julian found himself unable to set the matter aside. He sat in his study long after the household had gone to sleep, turning the day's small discoveries over in his mind. A botanist's daughter who danced like a lady raised in a fine house. A working woman who played the pianoforte with the careful precision of years of formal instruction. A young woman whose speech, whose posture, whose every careful gesture spoke of a life far removed from the humble background she claimed. He was not a foolish man, and he had begun to suspect, with growing certainty, that Alina Hart was not entirely who she claimed to be. His steward, Mr. Whitmore, a practical and somewhat suspicious man who had served the Ashcombe family for many years, had voiced similar concerns to Julian on more than one occasion since Evelina's arrival, though Julian had dismissed them each time, unwilling to examine too closely a feeling he did not entirely trust himself. But after the events of the Harvest Fair, he found himself, for the first time, seeking Whitmore out deliberately, rather than avoiding the conversation. "You have doubted her from the beginning," Julian said, finding the older man in the estate office, going over the household accounts by lamplight. "What exactly do you suspect?" Whitmore set down his pen and regarded his employer carefully. "I suspect, my lord, that Miss Hart is not the daughter of a humble botanist, whatever she may claim. I have written to an acquaintance in London, a man who keeps track of such matters for several great families in the city, asking whether any young woman of gentle birth has recently gone missing from her home. I expect a reply within the week." Julian felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest at the news, though he could not have said, in that moment, whether it was anger at Whitmore's interference or fear of what the answer might reveal. "You had no right to make such inquiries without my knowledge." "I had every right, my lord, as the man responsible for the safety and reputation of this household," Whitmore replied, unbothered by his employer's irritation. "If Miss Hart is hiding some scandal, some connection to a family seeking to avoid disgrace, it is far better that we learn the truth now, quietly, than allow it to become known publicly, to the ruin of this estate's already fragile standing." Julian had no answer for that. He knew Whitmore was right, even as some stubborn, unfamiliar part of him wished the older man had never sent the letter at all. He left the estate office without further argument and walked out into the dark gardens, needing the cold night air to clear the confusion crowding his thoughts. He found himself standing near the rebuilt greenhouse, its new glass panes catching the pale moonlight, and he thought of Evelina working there earlier that same week, carefully arranging cuttings along the new shelves. Her face lit with genuine happiness as she described to him, in surprising detail, the proper conditions needed to grow a rare variety of orchid his mother had once imported from abroad. Whatever she was hiding, he could not bring himself to believe it came from any wickedness in her character. But secrets, he knew from painful experience, did not need to come from wickedness to bring ruin down upon the people who kept them. Meanwhile, in a grand townhouse many miles away in London, the Earl of Rendlesham sat in his study, with a growing collection of unanswered letters spread across his desk, each one a report from men he had hired to search the countryside for any sign of his missing daughter. Beside him, Viscount Pembrey paced the length of the room with barely contained fury, his patience for the search wearing thinner with each passing week. "She cannot have vanished into thin air," Pembrey snapped, stopping to glare at the Earl. "A young woman of her breeding does not simply disappear without leaving some trace behind her." "My men are following every lead," the Earl said wearily, rubbing his eyes. He had aged considerably in the weeks since his daughter's disappearance, though whether from genuine worry for her safety or simple fear of the scandal her absence threatened remained unclear even to those who knew him best. "One of them believes he may have found something. A traveler recently passed through a small village in the western counties, matching Evelina's description, employed under a false name at the estate of some minor viscount there." Pembrey's expression sharpened with sudden dangerous interest. "Which estate?" "Thornfield Hall," the Earl said. "The seat of a Viscount Ashcombe, a young man of little consequence, I'm told, though not without some standing in his county." Pembrey said nothing further, but the calculating look that settled over his face left little doubt as to his intentions. He had lost a great deal of money and considerable pride when Evelina fled rather than marry him, and he did not intend to let either loss go unanswered. Whatever she had built for herself in her hiding place, however safe or happy she believed herself to be, Pembrey meant to see it destroyed the moment he found her, and he meant to be the one who found her first. Back at Thornfield Hall, unaware of the letters crossing the country in her name, Evelina lay awake in her small room, thinking not of her father's search parties or Pembrey's cold ambitions, but of the troubled look on Julian's face as he watched her play the pianoforte that afternoon. She did not yet know that Whitmore had already written to London, did not know that an answer confirming her true identity was already making its slow way back to Thornfield Hall. She knew only that the careful walls of her disguise had begun, in small and dangerous ways, to crack, and that she was running out of time to decide what she would do when they finally broke apart entirely. A week passed after the harvest fair, and though Julian said nothing further of his suspicions, Evelina noticed a subtle change in the way he watched her. It was not unkindness, exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as though he were waiting for her to reveal something she had not yet chosen to share. She told herself she imagined it. That fear was making her see doubt where none existed, but some quiet instinct warned her that the ground beneath her carefully built new life had begun to shift. Despite this, The days themselves remained full of a comfort she had not expected to find. The greenhouse was nearly finished, its new glass panes gleaming in the autumn light, and Evelina spent long afternoons arranging the rescued specimens along its shelves, cataloging each one with growing pride in the record she had built. Julian often joined her there, ostensibly to check on the progress of the rebuilding work, though Evelina suspected, with a small flutter of pleasure she tried hard to ignore, that he simply enjoyed her company more than he was willing to admit. One evening, as the sky turned soft shades of orange and violet over the western hills, Julian found her still working in the greenhouse long after the rest of the household had retired for supper. He brought 2 cups of tea from the kitchen, setting one down carefully on the workbench beside her without a word, and settled onto an overturned crate nearby, watching her label a row of small clay pots with quiet, practiced efficiency. "You have done more for these gardens in 2 months than my groundskeeper managed in 3 years, he said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I confess I did not expect, when I found you trespassing on my land, that you would prove quite so valuable." "I am glad to have been of use," Evelina said, setting down her pen and allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "Though I suspect you still have questions about how a wandering botanist came to know quite so much about a life she claims never to have lived." She had not meant to say it so plainly, and she saw the surprise flicker across his face at her sudden honesty. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of wind against the greenhouse glass. "I have many questions," Julian admitted finally, his voice quieter than usual. "But I have learned, in my own life, that some people carry burdens they are not yet ready to set down, and I would not wish to force you into revealing anything before you were prepared to share it freely." Evelina looked at him carefully, searching his face for any trace of judgment, but found only a kind of weary understanding that seemed to come from some private pain of his own. "You speak as though you understand such burdens rather well, my lord." Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring down into his cup of tea as though the answer might be found somewhere within it. "I was engaged once," he said finally, "some years ago, before my father's death made clear the true state of this family's finances. Her name was Margaret, the daughter of a baron with considerable land to the north. We were not deeply in love, I think, not in the way songs and novels describe such things, but we were fond of each other, and I believed in my youthful optimism that fondness would be enough to build a marriage upon." He paused, and Evelina found herself leaning forward slightly, unwilling to interrupt whatever difficult memory he was choosing, for the first time, to share with her. "When my father died and the extent of his debts became known, Margaret's family ended the engagement within a month," Julian continued, his voice carefully even, though Evelina could hear the old hurt still lingering beneath the words. "I do not blame them entirely. A marriage built on practical considerations cannot survive the loss of those very considerations. But it taught me something I have not been able to forget since, that the affection people show you is so often tied to what you can offer them, and that very few are willing to remain once that offering disappears." "That is a painfully lonely way to view the world," Evelina said softly. "Perhaps," Julian agreed, "though I have found little in my experience since to convince me otherwise. My own father valued this family's name and holdings above every other consideration, including, I sometimes believe, his own wife and son. I swore, after Margaret left, that I would never again build my life around anyone who valued only what I could provide, rather than who I actually was." Evelina felt something tighten painfully in her chest at his words, a sharp, uncomfortable awareness of how closely his old wound echoed her own situation, though from an entirely different direction. She had fled a marriage built entirely on what she could offer her father, on the debts her hand might settle, on the fortune tied to her name rather than anything true about her own heart. And here, sitting across from her, was a man who had been abandoned for the very reason she had run away, a man who feared discovering that anyone who claimed to care for him did so only for practical advantage. She thought in that moment of confessing everything. The words rose to her lips, urgent and frightening all at once. She wanted to tell him her true name, to explain the marriage she had fled and the father who valued her only as a debt to be settled, to make him understand that she, too, understood exactly what it meant to be loved only for what one could provide rather than who one truly was. But fear held her back. If she told him the truth now, she would have to admit not only her hidden identity, but the elaborate lie she had built to conceal it, the false letters, the invented history, the careful deceptions she had maintained for months under his own roof. She feared, with a sharp and sudden clarity, that he would see her confession not as an act of trust, but as final proof that she, too, was simply another person who had used him, however unintentionally, for her own advantage. "I am sorry," she said instead, her voice quieter than she intended, "that anyone would abandon you for such reasons." Julian looked up at her, something searching in his gaze, as though he sensed there was more she wished to say but had chosen not to. "You need not be sorry, Miss Hart. It taught me a valuable lesson, even if a painful one. And it has, perhaps, made me more careful in choosing who I allow close to me now." The way he said it, quiet and deliberate, made Evelina's breath catch, and for a long moment neither of them looked away from the other, the greenhouse around them growing dim as the last light of evening faded outside. She was acutely aware of how close he sat, of the warmth in his voice, of the careful trust he had just extended to her. However incomplete her own honesty remained in return. The moment broke when a sharp knock sounded at the greenhouse door, and Mrs. Doyle appeared, slightly out of breath, holding a lantern against the deepening dusk. "Forgive the interruption, my lord, but a traveler has come asking questions in the village again this evening." The innkeeper's wife sent word straight away, given the strangeness of it. Julian rose immediately, his easy, thoughtful manner replaced at once by careful attention. "What sort of questions?" "The same as before, my lord, only more pointed this time. Asking specifically after a young woman traveling under a false name, employed at a great house somewhere in the county. The innkeeper's wife thought it best you know at once, given that Miss Hart is our only recent arrival." Evelina felt the color drain from her face, though she fought hard to keep her expression composed. Julian glanced at her, and something in his eyes told her he had noticed her reaction, however carefully controlled, though he said nothing of it in front of Mrs. Doyle. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle. I will see to it," he said, and the housekeeper nodded and withdrew, leaving the two of them alone once more in the darkening greenhouse. "You should return to the house," Julian said quietly, turning to Evelina with an expression she could not quite read. "It grows late and the evening has turned cold." She nodded, gathering her things with hands that trembled more than she wished to admit, and followed him back through the darkened gardens toward the house. Neither of them spoke of the traveler's questions again that night, though the weight of them hung heavily between every careful word they exchanged along the path. Later that same evening, after Evelina had retired to her room, Julian found Whitmore waiting for him in the estate office, a folded letter in hand, his expression grim in the lamplight. "The reply from London has arrived, my lord," Whitmore said, holding out the letter. "I believe you will want to read it yourself." Julian took the letter with a strange, sinking feeling, already suspecting, before he had even broken the seal, that whatever it contained would confirm every careful suspicion he had gathered over the past weeks. He unfolded it slowly and read the neat, formal handwriting within, his expression growing more troubled with every line. The letter confirmed that Lady Evelina Ashworth, only daughter of the Earl of Rendlesham, had disappeared from her family's estate nearly 2 months prior, on the eve of her betrothal to Viscount Pembrey. It described her appearance in careful detail, a description that matched, in every particular, the young woman Julian knew as Elena Hart. It noted that her family had offered a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return, and that several men, including agents working directly for Pembrey himself, had been actively searching the countryside for any sign of her whereabouts. Julian set the letter down slowly, his hands unsteady, a strange mixture of anger, betrayal, and something else, something he was not yet ready to name, tightening painfully in his chest. Every careful moment he had shared with her over the past weeks, Every quiet confession, every small, growing trust, had been built upon a lie so complete that he had never once come close to guessing its true shape. "What will you do, my lord?" Whitmore asked quietly, watching his employer's face carefully. Julian did not answer at once. He stood in the dim lamplight of the estate office, the letter still clutched in his hand, and thought of Evelina sitting across from him in the greenhouse only hours before, her eyes soft with something that had looked, in that moment, entirely genuine. He did not yet know whether that softness had been real, or whether it, too, had been simply another careful piece of the performance she had maintained since the day she first appeared at the edge of his garden. "I do not know," he said finally, and the honesty of his own uncertainty frightened him more than the letter itself had. Outside, the wind moved gently through the newly rebuilt greenhouse, rustling the leaves of the plants Evelina had so carefully arranged over the past weeks, each one labeled in her own careful hand, each one a small, quiet piece of the life she had built at Thornfield Hall under a name that was not truly hers. Somewhere in the dark countryside beyond the estate's borders, a traveler continued asking careful questions in every village he passed, drawing steadily closer to the truth that Julian had just discovered alone, in the quiet of his study, with no one but Whitmore to witness the slow collapse of everything he thought he had begun to understand about the woman he had let so carefully into his guarded life. Julian did not confront Evelina that night, nor the following morning, though the weight of what he now knew pressed on every word he exchanged with her. He told himself he needed time to think, to decide what to do with the truth Whitmore's letter had revealed. But in his heart, he knew the real reason for his silence was simpler and far more uncomfortable. He did not yet know how to look at her without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, and he was not ready to see whatever expression crossed her face when she realized her secret had finally been discovered. Evelina, unaware that her true identity had already reached Julian's hands, spent those same days growing increasingly uneasy. The travelers' questions in the village had not stopped, and Mrs. Doyle reported with growing concern that he had begun asking specifically about Thornfield Hall itself, inquiring after the household's newest employee with a persistence that unsettled even the normally unflappable innkeeper's wife. On the third morning after the greenhouse conversation, Evelina rose early as usual and made her way to the garden, hoping the familiar work might quiet the anxious thoughts that had kept her awake through most of the night. She had not gone far along the path when she noticed a fine carriage standing at the edge of the drive, its horses still steaming faintly in the cool morning air, clearly having traveled through the night to arrive so early. Her heart seized with sudden, sharp fear even before the carriage door opened, and a familiar figure stepped down onto the gravel. Viscount Pembrey looked exactly as she remembered him, tall and coldly handsome, his expensive coat immaculate despite the long journey, his pale eyes finding her across the distance of the garden with an ease that told her he had known precisely where to look. She froze where she stood, every instinct screaming at her to run, though her feet refused to move, held in place by a fear so old and familiar it felt like stepping backward into the very life she had fled. "There you are," Pembrey said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet morning air, pleasant on its surface but sharp underneath, like a blade wrapped carefully in silk. "I confess, Evelina, you led us on quite a chase. Your father has been beside himself with worry, though I suspect his worry has rather more to do with his creditors than with your safety." "You should not be here," Evelina said, finding her voice at last, though it shook more than she wished. "I made my choice clear when I left. I will not return with you." Pembrey laughed softly, stepping closer, his polished boots crunching against the gravel path. "Your choice, as you call it, was never truly yours to make. Your father agreed to our arrangement, and a debt of honor between gentlemen does not simply dissolve because a foolish young woman took a notion to run away and play at being a common laborer." His gaze moved briefly over her plain, dirt-stained gown with open distaste. "Though I must say, the disguise suits you rather less well than you likely imagined." Before Evelina could answer, the sound of quick footsteps drew both their attention toward the house, where Julian was approaching with visible alarm, having spotted the unfamiliar carriage from his study window. He reached Evelina's side within moments, positioning himself instinctively between her and the stranger, though he did not yet know precisely who the man was or what danger he might represent. "This is private land," Julian said, his voice carrying the same sharp authority Evelina remembered from their first meeting in the garden. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "Viscount Pembry," the man said, offering a shallow, mocking bow. "And you, I take it, are the young lord who has been sheltering my missing bride under a false name these past 2 months, whether knowingly or otherwise." Julian's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly and painfully across his features, though he had already known, since reading Whitmore's letter, precisely what truth Pembry's arrival now confirmed aloud. He glanced at Evelina, and she saw, with a sinking heart, that whatever careful composure he had maintained since discovering her secret finally broke apart entirely in that single, unguarded moment. "You knew," she whispered, reading the truth in his eyes before he spoke a single word. "I learned 2 nights ago," Julian said quietly, not looking away from her, though his voice carried none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. "I had not yet decided what to do with the knowledge." Pembry, sensing an opportunity in the sudden tension between them, stepped forward with renewed confidence. "Then allow me to simplify matters for you both. Lady Evelina Ashworth is betrothed to me, an arrangement made in good faith between her father and myself, and I have come to escort her back to London, where the wedding will proceed as originally planned, whatever inconvenient detour she has chosen to take along the way." "I will not go with you," Evelina said, finding her courage again despite the fear still coursing through her. "I left because I would rather have nothing than spend my life bound to a man I do not respect and cannot love. That has not changed, whatever you and my father believe you are entitled to." Pembry's pleasant mask slipped for the first time, his pale eyes narrowing with genuine anger. "You forget yourself. Your father's debts are considerable, and I am the only man willing to settle them in exchange for your hand. Without this marriage, he loses everything, the estate, the family name, all of it. Do you truly wish to be remembered as the daughter whose selfishness ruined her own family?" "I would rather be remembered as a woman who chose her own life," Evelina answered, "than as a debt paid off to save a man who never once considered my happiness in any of his calculations." Pembry's expression darkened further, and he took another step forward, close enough now that Julian moved instinctively to block his path entirely. "I would advise you to remember whose land you are standing on, my lord, before you involve yourself further in a matter that does not concern you." "She is employed under my household's protection," Julian said, his voice low and hard, "which makes her welfare very much my concern, whatever claims you believe you hold over her." For a tense moment, the 2 men stood facing each other, the air between them thick with barely restrained conflict, while Evelina stood frozen behind Julian, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might be heard by both of them. Pembry's gaze flicked briefly toward the house, toward the small gathering of servants who had begun to appear at windows and doorways, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and something in his calculating expression suggested he was reconsidering the wisdom of pressing the confrontation any further in front of so many witnesses. "Very well," Pembry said finally, his voice regaining its cold, controlled pleasantness, though the anger beneath it remained plainly visible. "I will return to the inn in the village for now, but understand this, my lord, and understand it clearly. I will not leave this county without her, and I have the full authority of her father behind my claim. You may delay the inevitable, but you cannot prevent it." He turned and climbed back into his carriage without another word, and the vehicle pulled away down the long drive, leaving a heavy, uneasy silence behind it. Evelina let out a shaking breath she had not realized she was holding, and beside her, Julian remained tense and watchful until the carriage had disappeared entirely from view. Then slowly he turned to face her, and the anger that had been simmering beneath his controlled exterior finally broke through. "An earl's daughter," he said quietly, though the quiet carried more weight than shouting might have. "A betrothal to a viscount. Months of careful lies told to my face, in my own gardens, in my own house. "I never meant to deceive you out of cruelty," Evelina said, tears burning at the edges of her eyes though she fought hard to keep them from falling. "I was frightened. I had nowhere else to go, no name I could safely use, no way to explain the truth without risking discovery by the very man who just stood in your garden threatening us both." "You could have trusted me," Julian said, his voice rough with something between anger and hurt. "I told you, in that greenhouse, exactly what it meant to me to be valued only for what I could offer someone. And you sat across from me, knowing precisely how closely your own situation echoed mine, and said nothing." "I wanted to tell you," Evelina said, the words spilling out now, urgent and desperate. "I nearly did that very evening. But I was afraid, Julian, afraid that the moment you learned the truth, you would see me exactly as you see me now, as another person who used you and lied to you for my own advantage. I did not want to lose what we had built here before I was ready to lose it." Julian said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet held her fast in place. "I need time," he said finally, his voice quieter now, though still guarded. "I cannot simply set aside months of careful deception, because you offer a frightened explanation for it now, after the truth has already been forced into the open by another man's arrival." He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for her response, leaving Evelina standing alone in the garden, exactly as she had stood on her very first day at Thornfield Hall, though everything about her circumstances had changed entirely since then. She pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, holding back the sob that threatened to break free, and looked out toward the empty drive where Pembry's carriage had disappeared, knowing with cold, sinking certainty that he had not given up, and that whatever fragile safety she had found at Thornfield Hall now stood on the very edge of collapse. That evening, as the household settled into an uneasy quiet, Whitmore came to find Julian in his study, his expression grim with fresh news gathered from a groundskeeper who had ridden into the village on an errand. "Viscount Pembry has taken rooms at the inn, my lord, and word is he has sent riders out already, gathering men from the county to assist in what he is calling a lawful recovery of his intended bride. He means to return here within days, and I fear he does not intend to ask politely a second time." Julian sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the dying fire in his hearth, thinking of Evelina's frightened, honest face in the garden that morning, of the raw fear in her voice when she spoke of a marriage she would rather lose everything than endure. Whatever anger and hurt still lingered in his own chest over her deception, a colder, more urgent question had begun to press against it, demanding an answer he was not yet certain he was ready to give. Whatever he decided, he understood clearly now that Pembry would not simply walk away, and that the coming days would demand far more from him than careful gardening records and quiet, guarded evenings by the fire. 3 days passed after Pembry's carriage disappeared down the drive, 3 days of tense, watchful quiet at Thornfield Hall, during which Julian spoke to Evelina only when necessary, his manner polite but distant, like a man carefully guarding a wound he did not wish anyone to notice. Evelina continued her work in the gardens out of habit more than purpose, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind remained fixed on the danger gathering somewhere beyond the estate's borders. On the morning of the 4th day, word reached Thornfield Hall that Pembry had not been idle during his stay at the village inn. He had gathered a small party of men, some hired for the purpose, others local fellows persuaded by coin rather than conviction, and he had obtained, through means no one at the hall could quite determine, a document bearing an official seal, which he claimed granted him lawful authority to reclaim his betrothed on behalf of her family. Mrs. Doyle brought the news to the breakfast table with a face drained of its usual cheerful color, and Julian set down his cup with careful precision, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the calm he was trying to project. "He means to come here today," Whitmore confirmed, having ridden out early to gather what information he could from the village. "Within the hour, by most accounts. He has been telling anyone who will listen that Miss Hart, or Lady Evelina, as he insists on calling her now, has been unlawfully kept from her family, and that any who interfere with her return will answer to the magistrate." Evelina felt the blood drain from her face, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. He cannot simply take me by force, surely. Not in front of witnesses, not without some proper legal process. Men with money and connections have managed stranger things, Julian said grimly, rising from the table. Whatever paper he carries, real or invented, he intends to use it as cover for exactly the kind of force you fear. We have very little time to decide how we mean to answer him. Within the hour, precisely as Whitmore had warned, the sound of many horses and wheels grew audible along the drive, and the household gathered uneasily near the front entrance, watching as Pembry's carriage rolled to a stop, flanked by 6 mounted men whose grim, purposeful expressions left little doubt as to why they had been hired. Pembry himself stepped down first, dressed in the same immaculate manner as before, though his pleasant mask had thinned considerably since their last meeting, revealing the cold determination beneath it. "Lord Ashcombe," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the gravel drive, "I have come as promised to collect what is rightfully mine. I would prefer to avoid any unpleasantness, but I assure you, I am fully prepared to see this matter through by whatever means prove necessary." Julian stepped forward, positioning himself deliberately at the top of the entrance steps, with Evelina and the gathered household behind him. "You will find no unpleasantness here, my lord, so long as you conduct yourself as a gentleman ought. But I will not stand aside while you attempt to remove a member of my household by force, whatever paper you carry." Pembry produced the document with a flourish, holding it aloft though he made no move to actually hand it over for examination. "This declares Lady Evelina Ashworth to be a ward under her father's authority, unlawfully removed from his protection, and grants myself, as her betrothed and her father's chosen agent, full authority to see her safely returned to his household. I do not require your permission, my lord, only your cooperation, unless you wish to explain to a magistrate why you obstructed a father's lawful recovery of his own daughter." A murmur moved through the gathered servants, and Evelina felt the weight of every eye turning toward her, some sympathetic, others simply frightened by the sudden, dangerous turn the morning had taken. She stepped forward, past Julian's protective stance, though he reached out briefly as if to stop her before letting his hand fall away. "I will speak for myself," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying clearly across the tense silence of the drive. "I am not a ward unlawfully removed, my lord. I am a grown woman who chose, freely and with full understanding of the consequences, to leave a marriage arranged entirely for my father's financial benefit, without a single thought given to my own wishes in the matter. If you truly believe the law grants you authority to drag an unwilling woman back into such an arrangement, I invite you to bring your magistrate here and let him examine the matter properly, in the light of day, rather than attempting to settle it through intimidation on a private estate." Pembry's expression flickered with something close to genuine anger at her defiance, though he quickly smoothed it back into cold composure. Brave words for a woman who has spent 2 months hiding under a false name, because she knew perfectly well that her actions would not survive honest scrutiny. "I hid because I was frightened of exactly this," Evelina said, gesturing toward the armed men flanking his carriage. "Because I understood that a man determined to have his way would not hesitate to use force against a woman with no protection of her own. I see now that my fears were entirely justified." The tension along the drive stretched taut as a drawn bowstring, and for a long, dangerous moment no one moved. Then Pembry gestured sharply to the men beside him, and 2 of them dismounted, moving toward the steps with grim, purposeful intent. Julian moved instantly, placing himself directly in their path, and Whitmore, along with 2 of the estate's own groundskeepers, stepped forward as well, forming a rough line of resistance across the entrance. "You will need to remove me from this doorway before you touch her," Julian said, his voice low and utterly without doubt. "And I promise you, my lord, that will not happen quietly, nor without consequence to your own reputation, whatever authority you believe that paper grants you." For a moment, it seemed the standoff might break into open confrontation, the hired men hesitating, glancing uncertainly toward Pembry for further instruction, clearly unprepared for organized resistance from a household they had expected to overwhelm easily. But before Pembry could give the order to press forward, the sound of another carriage arriving along the drive drew every eye away from the tense scene at the entrance. The new carriage was grander than Pembry's own, bearing a crest Evelina recognized instantly with a fresh wave of cold dread. And as it rolled to a stop, the door opened to reveal her father, the Earl of Rendlesham, stepping down onto the gravel with the same weary, calculating expression she remembered so well from every difficult conversation of her childhood. "Father," she said, the word escaping her before she could stop it, equal parts fear and something else. Something almost like hope that his presence might change the shape of the confrontation unfolding before her. The Earl took in the scene slowly, his gaze moving from Pembry's armed men to Julian's determined stance at the top of the steps, and finally settling on his daughter, standing pale but unwavering among the household that had gathered to protect her. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his tired expression, though whether it was concern for her safety or simple calculation about how best to salvage the situation, Evelina could not yet tell. "Enough," the Earl said, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and to Evelina's considerable surprise, Pembry's men actually paused, glancing toward him uncertainly. "I did not travel 3 days to watch armed men storm a private household in my daughter's name. Pembry, stand your men down. We will settle this matter properly, as gentlemen, not through a public spectacle that will only invite scandal upon us all." Pembry's jaw tightened with obvious frustration, but he did not dare openly defy the Earl in front of so many witnesses, and after a long, tense moment, he gestured curtly for his men to withdraw toward the carriages. The immediate danger passed, though the air remained thick with unresolved tension, and Evelina found herself watching her father with cautious, uncertain hope, unsure whether his intervention represented genuine concern for her well-being or simply a more careful strategy toward the same unwanted outcome. "We will speak inside," the Earl said, looking toward Julian with an appraising, curious expression, as though seeing for the first time the young Viscount who had sheltered his missing daughter for the past 2 months. "All of us, I think, have a great deal to discuss." Julian hesitated only a moment before nodding and stepping aside to allow the Earl entry, though his eyes found Evelina's briefly as the older man passed, and in that brief exchange, she saw something that steadied her more than any words could have. Whatever hurt and uncertainty still lingered between them since the truth of her identity had come to light, he had stood at the top of those steps and placed himself directly between her and the men who had come to take her away, without a single moment of hesitation. Whatever came next, in the difficult conversation that was about to unfold within the walls of Thornfield Hall, she understood, with quiet and growing certainty, that she was no longer facing it entirely alone. As the household filed inside behind the Earl and Pembry, Mrs. Doyle caught Evelina's arm gently, her earlier fear replaced now with fierce, protective determination. "Whatever happens in there, my lady," she said quietly, using the title for the first time without hesitation, "you have more friends in this house than you know." Evelina managed a small, grateful smile, though her heart still pounded with uncertainty as she followed the others into the hall, toward whatever difficult reckoning awaited her within its walls. The morning's danger had passed, but she understood clearly that the true battle, the one that would determine the whole shape of her future, was only just beginning. The study at Thornfield Hall had never held so many people at once, and Evelina stood near the window, watching her father settle into the chair Julian offered him, while Pembry remained standing near the door, his arms crossed and his expression carefully controlled, though the anger beneath it had not fully faded. "I will speak plainly," the Earl began, folding his hands in his lap with the weary composure of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times during the long journey from London. "Evelina, your disappearance has caused considerable damage to this family's standing. Whatever grievances you hold against the arrangement made for you, running away and living under a false name has not solved them. It has only made everything considerably worse." The arrangement was never mine to accept, father, Evelina said, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar tightness gathering in her chest. You made it on my behalf, without asking whether I wish to spend my life bound to a man I have never respected, in exchange for settling debts you accumulated through your own choices, not mine. The Earl's expression flickered with something that might have been shame, quickly hidden away beneath practiced composure. The debts are real, Evelina, whatever their cause. Without Pembry's arrangement, this family loses the estate entirely. I do not enjoy asking this of you, but I have very few options remaining. Then perhaps, Julian said quietly, speaking for the first time since the conversation began, it is worth examining more carefully why Viscount Pembry is so determined to secure this particular marriage, rather than simply extending a loan on ordinary terms, as any other gentleman of his considerable means might have done. Pembry's composed expression sharpened with sudden wariness. I fail to see what business that is of yours, Ashcombe. I made some inquiries of my own over the past several days, Julian continued, unmoved by the interruption, through connections in London rather more familiar with financial matters than my own limited experience with such things. It seems Viscount Pembry has, in recent years, developed something of a pattern. Marriages arranged with families burdened by considerable debt, secured through generous settlements that appear, on the surface, remarkably charitable. And yet, in at least 2 previous instances, involving 2 previous wives, both marriages ended rather abruptly, and rather profitably for Pembry alone, through circumstances that were never fully explained to satisfaction. A heavy silence fell across the study, and Evelina watched her father's face carefully, seeing genuine surprise there for the first time since his arrival. What exactly are you suggesting, Ashcombe? I am suggesting, Julian said, that Pembry's interest in your daughter has considerably less to do with affection or even simple practical arrangement, and rather more to do with a pattern of acquiring vulnerable estates through marriage, only to see those marriages end in ways that leave him considerably wealthier, and his wives' families considerably worse off than before the arrangement began. I would encourage you, my Lord Earl, to examine the fate of Pembry's previous wives rather more closely before proceeding any further. Pembry's face had gone pale with fury, though he fought visibly to maintain his composure. These are baseless accusations, spread by a man with obvious personal interest in seeing this marriage fail. Perhaps, Julian acknowledged evenly, though I would think a man confident in his own innocence would welcome careful examination of his past arrangements, rather than dismissing the suggestion so quickly. The Earl looked between the 2 men for a long, considering moment, and then turned his attention fully to Evelina, studying her with an expression she had rarely seen from him, something that looked almost like genuine concern rather than mere calculation. Is this true, what he says of your feelings, that you would rather lose the estate entirely than proceed with this marriage? Yes, father, Evelina said, meeting his gaze steadily. I would rather see us lose everything honestly than gain security through an arrangement built on my own misery, especially one that now appears to carry rather more danger than either of us understood when you first proposed it. The Earl was quiet for a long moment, and Evelina watched, with cautious, uncertain hope, as something in his tired expression seemed to shift and soften, though whether from genuine care for her well-being or simple fear of the scandal that Julian's accusations might bring down upon them both, she could not entirely tell. Pembry, the Earl said finally, turning to the other man with new, careful wariness in his voice, I believe we require rather more time to consider this arrangement properly, given what has been suggested here today. I will not proceed with my daughter's marriage until I have satisfied myself, through my own careful inquiry, that these accusations hold no merit. This is outrageous, Pembry snapped, his careful composure finally cracking entirely. I have spent considerable money and effort locating your daughter, Rendlesham, and I will not be dismissed on the basis of unfounded rumors spread by a jealous rival. You will be dismissed on the basis of my own judgment as her father, the Earl said, his voice hardening with sudden, unexpected authority, which is, whatever else may be said of me, still mine alone to exercise. You may leave Thornfield Hall today, my lord, and you may consider our arrangement suspended indefinitely, until such time as these questions are properly answered." Pembry stood rigid with fury for a long moment, his gaze moving between the Earl, Julian, and finally Evelina herself, and something cold and dangerous flickered across his expression before he mastered it once more into careful composure. "Very well," he said stiffly. "Though I would advise you, Rendlesham, to consider carefully how you intend to settle your considerable debts without my assistance, before you dismiss my offer so completely." He turned and left the study without another word, and moments later, the sound of his carriage and the departing hoofbeats of his hired men faded slowly down the long drive, leaving behind a silence that felt, for the first time in weeks, genuinely free of danger. The Earl remained seated for a long moment after Pembry's departure, staring at nothing in particular, before finally turning his attention back to his daughter. "The debts remain, Evelina, whatever else has been resolved here today. I do not know how I am to settle them now." "Perhaps," Julian said carefully, "that is a conversation better suited to another day, my lord, when the shock of this morning's events has had time to properly settle. For now, I would simply ask that you allow your daughter the choice she was denied when this arrangement was first made, whatever shape her future ultimately takes." The Earl studied Julian for a long moment, something calculating returning briefly to his tired eyes, though it settled, eventually, into something closer to weary resignation. "You have taken considerable risk on my daughter's behalf, Lord Ashcombe, for a woman who deceived you as thoroughly as she deceived the rest of us. I confess I do not entirely understand your reasons." Julian glanced toward Evelina, and something passed between them in that shared look, quiet and unguarded, that neither of them had allowed themselves to fully acknowledge until that very moment. "My reasons, my lord, are rather simpler than you might imagine. Whatever name she used, whatever story she told to protect herself, the woman who worked in my gardens these past 2 months proved herself, through every honest action, to be exactly the sort of person worth protecting. I do not require a title or a fortune to recognize genuine character when I see it." The Earl said nothing further for a long moment, and then, with visible effort, he rose from his chair. "I will require several days to consider matters properly, and to make appropriate inquiries into Pembry's past conduct before proceeding further with anyone's plans. In the meantime, Evelina, I would ask that you remain here, under Lord Ashcombe's protection, until this matter is fully resolved." "Thank you, father," Evelina said quietly, genuine surprise and cautious hope mingling in her voice. The Earl departed within the hour, leaving behind a household still settling from the morning's dangerous confrontation, and Evelina found herself, once the last carriage had disappeared down the drive, standing alone with Julian in the quiet entrance hall, uncertain how to begin addressing everything that remained unresolved between them. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Not simply for the deception itself, but for not trusting you sooner with the truth, even after everything you shared with me that evening in the greenhouse." "You owed yourself safety first," Julian said, his earlier anger softened now into something gentler, more thoughtful. "I understand that rather better now than I did 3 days ago, watching you stand at the top of my steps and refuse to be taken by force, even when the odds seemed entirely against you. I do not think, looking back, that I could have asked you to trust a stranger with a secret that dangerous, however unfair the resulting silence made me feel." "And now?" Evelina asked softly, searching his face with careful, hopeful uncertainty. "Now," Julian said, stepping closer, "I find that I am considerably less interested in the name you were born with, or the fortune attached to it, than I am in the woman who spent 2 months rebuilding my mother's gardens with more care and dedication than anyone I have ever known. Whatever your father ultimately decides about his debts, and whatever becomes of his estate, I find I would very much like to continue knowing that woman, if she is willing to let me." Evelina felt something warm and unguarded finally break free in her chest, the careful walls she had maintained for so long softening at last under the weight of his words. "I would like that very much, my lord." "Julian," he corrected gently, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his careful composure. "I think, after everything we have survived together this past week, we might dispense with such formal titles between us." In the days that followed, the Earl's inquiries into Pembrey's past conduct revealed troubling patterns that confirmed Julian's suspicions entirely, and quiet arrangements were eventually made to settle the family's debts through more honest means, including a modest but genuine investment from Julian himself, offered not out of obligation, but out of a growing, deeply felt affection for the woman who had transformed his neglected gardens into something worthy of his mother's memory once again. Months later, when the wedding finally took place, it was held not in some grand London cathedral befitting an earl's daughter, but in the very gardens where Evelina had first arrived as a frightened, disguised stranger, surrounded by the rare flowers and carefully rebuilt greenhouse that had become, over the course of one remarkable season, the true beginning of her genuine, unhidden life. Mrs. Doyle wept openly through the entire ceremony, and Whitmore, gruff as ever, admitted afterward that he had known from the very first week that Miss Hart would prove far more valuable to the household than any ordinary botanist ever could have been. Standing among the blooming roses his mother had once planted with her own hands, Julian took Evelina's hands in his and made his final, unguarded promise, not to a false name born of desperate necessity, but to the true woman who had earned, through every honest hour of careful, difficult work, a love built on far sturdier ground than any arrangement of debts and titles could ever have provided. And as the gathered household and villagers applauded warmly around them, Evelina understood, with quiet and complete certainty, that the disguise she had once worn out of fear had led her, against every careful expectation, to the one place in the world where she had finally been allowed to become entirely and unashamedly herself. 2 years passed at Thornfield Hall, and the gardens that had once stood ruined and forgotten now drew visitors from across the county, drawn by their reputation as some of the finest in the region, filled with rare specimens carefully catalogued in a leather-bound ledger that had grown thick with new entries since its first careful pages. Evelina, now Lady Ashcombe in truth as well as name, spent her mornings there still. Though her days had grown fuller with new responsibilities she had never imagined for herself during those frightened first weeks of her disguise. The greenhouse, long since finished and expanded twice over, had become something of a small sensation among botanists across England, and Evelina found herself corresponding regularly with scholars and collectors who had heard of her genuine expertise, never once suspecting that the woman advising them on rare orchid cultivation had once invented her entire knowledge of the subject as a desperate cover story, rather than a lifelong calling that had since become entirely real. Her father visited twice a year, his relationship with her still careful and imperfect, though considerably warmer than it had been during the cold, calculating years of her childhood. The debts that had once threatened to destroy his family had been settled honestly, through a combination of careful management, a modest inheritance from a distant relative, and Julian's own generous investment, made not as a condition of marriage but as a genuine gift between family. And though the Earl still occasionally lapsed into his old habits of careful calculation, he had never again attempted to arrange his daughter's future without her full and willing consent. Pembrey's fate had unfolded quietly but decisively in the months following that tense confrontation at Thornfield Hall. The Earl's careful inquiries, combined with information Julian had gathered through his own London connections, eventually uncovered enough evidence of Pembrey's troubling pattern of predatory marriages to see him quietly but firmly excluded from respectable society, his reputation ruined not through public scandal, which the families involved wished carefully to avoid, but through the far more effective mechanism of whispered warnings passed discreetly between the very circles whose approval he had always depended upon. He was last known to have removed himself to the continent, where his particular talents for exploiting vulnerable families found rather less welcome reception than they once had in England, and neither Julian nor Evelina heard his name mentioned again in any context that concerned them directly. Mrs. Doyle remained at Thornfield Hall, her authority over the household only growing with the years, and she took particular pride in the fact that she had recognized something genuine in the frightened young stranger who first arrived at the garden gate, long before anyone else at the hall had guessed the truth behind her careful disguise. Whitmore, too, remained, his suspicious nature gradually softening into something closer to genuine affection for the lady he had once investigated so thoroughly, though he never fully abandoned his careful habit of verifying every new arrival's story before extending his trust too freely. The greenhouse itself held a particular significance for both Julian and Evelina, one that grew only more meaningful as the years passed. It was there, among the rebuilt glass panes and carefully tended specimens, that Julian had first begun to trust a stranger with the painful truth of his own broken engagement. And it was there, nearly 3 years after that quiet evening conversation, that their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's careful, observant eyes and her father's quiet, thoughtful manner, delivered in the depths of a particularly harsh winter, when the roads to the nearest proper physician had proven impassable, leaving only Mrs. Doyle's steady hands and Julian's constant, anxious presence to see mother and child safely through the ordeal. They named her Rose, in honor of the very flowers that had first brought Evelina and Julian together in that overgrown garden bed on the morning of her arrival. And as the child grew, she spent nearly as much time among the flower beds as her mother once had, learning the names of plants from Evelina with the same careful patience Evelina herself had once learned them from her own mother, in a different garden, in a different life that felt now, looking back, like something that had happened to an entirely different woman. Evelina often thought, in quiet moments spent working among the roses her mother-in-law had first planted so many years before, of the frightened young woman who had walked up the long drive toward Thornfield Hall with nothing but a bag of pressed flowers and a desperate, invented name. She thought of how close she had come in those early weeks to losing everything through a single careless slip, a single suspicious traveler, a single letter left at the wrong village inn. And she thought, most often, of the quiet, guarded man who had found her trespassing in his garden and chosen, against every careful instinct his own painful history had taught him, to extend his trust to a stranger who badly needed it. Julian, for his part, never regretted the choice he had made in that tense study conversation with the Earl, standing firmly beside a woman whose deception had wounded him deeply, even as he recognized, with growing clarity, that the wound had come not from any wickedness in her character, but from the same fear and desperation that had once driven his own broken engagement to end so painfully. He had learned, through Evelina's honest, difficult work in his gardens, that trust built slowly through genuine action carried far more weight than any name or title ever could, and he found himself, in the years that followed their marriage, considerably less troubled by his father's old debts and his family's fragile reputation, secure in a partnership built on something sturdier than either fortune or convenient arrangement. The estate itself flourished alongside the gardens, its finances gradually recovering under careful management, its tenant farms improving under new agricultural methods Julian had studied and implemented with the same careful dedication he brought to his botanical work. Visitors who came to admire the famous gardens at Thornfield Hall often remarked on the unusual warmth of the household, the easy affection between its lord and lady, the genuine happiness of the small, growing family that had built their life together, among the very flower beds where their whole story had begun under such uncertain, dangerous circumstances. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Julian and Evelina walked together through the gardens at dusk, past the greenhouse where so many of their most important conversations had taken place, past the rose beds where they had exchanged their vows, and eventually to the quiet spot near the old stone wall where Evelina had first stepped through the garden gate as a frightened stranger calling herself by a name that was not truly hers. They rarely spoke much during these walks, content simply to stand together in comfortable silence, watching the last light of evening settle over the gardens they had rebuilt together, each of them privately grateful for the strange, uncertain chain of events that had brought them to this particular life, in this particular place, with each other. Rose grew older each year, joined eventually by a younger brother named Edmund, after Evelina's father, whose relationship with his grandchildren proved considerably warmer and more genuine than his relationship with his own daughter had once been during her difficult childhood. The children grew up understanding, in careful, age-appropriate pieces shared over the years, the remarkable story of how their parents had first met, though Evelina always made certain to emphasize, whenever she told the tale, that the most important lesson was not the deception itself, but the courage it had taken to eventually choose honesty, even when honesty carried real and frightening risk. Thornfield Hall, once a house burdened by debt and quiet grief, became known throughout the county not merely for its remarkable gardens, but for the genuine warmth and happiness that seemed to fill every room within its walls. Julian often reflected, in his quieter moments, that his mother would have been deeply pleased to see her carefully planted gardens not only restored to their former beauty, but transformed into the very place where her own son had finally found the kind of honest, unguarded love she herself had always hoped he might discover, however unlikely its beginning had first appeared. And Evelina, who had once fled into the darkness with nothing but a false name and a desperate hope for safety, found herself, years later, standing in the very gardens that had first sheltered her, no longer hiding behind any invented story, but living, fully and openly, as exactly the woman she had always been beneath every careful disguise, loved not for her title or her fortune, but for the genuine courage and character that had carried her through every difficult, uncertain step of her remarkable journey. The gardens continued to bloom each season, carefully tended by the family that had built their entire life around them, and the story of the Earl's daughter who had once disguised herself as a wandering botanist, and the guarded young lord who had fallen in love with her false name before ever learning her true one, became, in time, simply the quiet, happy history of Thornfield Hall itself, remembered fondly by everyone who had witnessed its remarkable, uncertain beginning.